Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us on this beautiful sunny day. My name is Emily Beanie. I'm Chief Curator of the Legion of Honor and Barbara Wolf, Curator in charge of European Paintings. And today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Isabella Lores-Chavez, Associate Curator of European Paintings. We'll hear from her today about some masterpieces of the Northern Baroque collection in the context of Dutch national identity in the 17th century. And this is just a reminder that this is the 6th lecture in a series that this year celebrates the permanent collections of the Legion of Honor, which, as you may know, is celebrating its 100th birthday. So please, hooray, yes. So please do come back every second Saturday throughout this centennial year to hear from different members of curatorial staff about the treasures housed here that belong to all San Franciscans. So before we get started, I'd like to share our institutional land acknowledgement. The Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco occupy unceded land of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of what is now the San Francisco Peninsula. The Greater Bay Area is also the ancestral territory of other Ohlone peoples, as well as the Miwok, Yakuts, and Patwin. We acknowledge, recognize, and honor the indigenous ancestors, elders, and descendants whose nations and communities have lived in the Bay Area over many generations and continue to do so today. We respect the enduring relationships that exist between indigenous peoples and their homelands. We are committed to partnering with indigenous communities to raise awareness of their legacy and engage with the history of the region, the impacts of genocide, and the dynamics of settler colonialism that persist. Lincoln Park, where the Legion of Honor was founded in 1924, operated as city cemetery from 1868 to 1898. When the park was created, many of the burials were relocated, but the majority were not. Please join the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco in honoring the memory of the thousands of individuals still buried in this land. So, Dr. Isabella Lores-Chavez is Associate Curator of European Paintings at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, with responsibility for our Dutch and Flemish holdings. She completed her PhD in art history at Columbia University in 2022 with a dissertation on plaster casts in 17th century Dutch paintings. That is slated for publication as a book later this year. Her doctoral work was supported by some of the most prestigious fellowships in the field, including a Rousseau Fellowship from the Metropolitan Museum of Art and a Kress Fellowship from the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. As an undergraduate at Yale, she held curatorial internships at the J. Paul Getty Museum and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and upon her graduation in 2013, she organized an exhibition of Dutch and French drawings from the Robert Lehman collection at the Met. Born in Columbia and raised in Los Angeles, she joined the Fine Arts Museums in 2022 and is the curator, most recently, of celebrating 100 years at the Legion of Honor, now on view in our ground floor galleries, so do be sure to check that out. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Thank you so much, Emily, for that introduction and for organizing this amazing lecture series that has been so well attended by you all. And thank you also to my colleagues in public programs, especially Maria Guavil and Rocio Garcia for all their help organizing today, and our colleagues in web and digital and the AV team. Okay. On a hilltop overlooking the Vaal River, the tower of a fortress rises into a blue sky swept with billowing clouds. Below, from a ferry in the placid water, two men on horseback look up at the fortifications, redirecting the viewer's own gaze. Here is the Valkhof, a monument with ancient origins that was understood in the 17th century as a symbol of resistance and resilience. Sorry about that. The year 1648, when Salomon van Ruysdael painted this captivating landscape, was a turning point in the history of the Dutch Republic, where a fledgling sense of national identity was bound up in places like the Valkhof. Oh dear, it's very sensitive. Today, we might link Dutch culture with a different sort of landmark, the quintessential windmill, as seen here in a later painting by Van Ruysdael's nephew Jacob, Windmills did, in fact, appear frequently in 17th century landscapes, forging what would become a lasting association with Dutchness. The longevity of this idea is clearly visible to us just a mile and a half from here in Golden Gate Park, where the so-called Dutch windmill has stood since 1902, one of 2 windmills constructed by the Park Commission to pump water for park irrigation. At its base is the Queen Wilhelmina Garden, named after the Queen of the Netherlands reigning at the time of the windmill's construction, and still planted with tulip bulbs donated each year by the Dutch Bulb Growers Association. But why does the windmill represent Dutchness so effectively? This national symbol arose out of circumstances that also made the Valkhof a potent vessel for a kind of nationalist sentiment in the 17th century. Over the course of today's lecture, it will be my immense pleasure to introduce you to or reacquaint you with Dutch paintings at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. It's one of the strongest areas of the European paintings collection. We'll step into these masterpieces to tease out the contours of a distinctive collective identity developed during a period of both war and prosperity in the newly established Dutch Republic. Van Ruysdael's river view of Nijmegen with the Valkhof represents the culmination of an approach to painting the land that was intertwined with a sort of nationalistic pride in the region. Landscape emerged as an independent genre of painting in the early 17th century, and its pioneering practitioners looked to the terrain around them as a primary subject. Their predecessors had preferred inventing fantastical vistas. This landscape imagines a journey through a mountainous region, unlike anything in the Netherlands, known as the Low Countries precisely because much of the land is below or at sea level. Early Dutch landscape specialists, such as Isaias van de Velde, prioritized local environments instead, turning their powers of observation to the topographical features of their immediate surroundings. Van de Velde's 1622 masterpiece, The Ferry, ranks among the earliest Dutch paintings devoted to the local landscape, delighting in the flat land traversed by waterways. Solomon van Ruysdael, who may have studied with Van de Velde, was a leading figure in the subsequent generation of landscape painters, along with his friend and rival Jan van Goyen. Van Goyen and Van Ruysdael took cues from one another throughout their careers, though their artistic preferences differ in important ways. Both painters focused on distinctively Dutch environments: sand dunes, rivers, lakes and estuaries, towns where the land met the North Sea. Van Goyen popularized the use of a low horizon line, and Van Ruysdael followed suit. More particular to Van Goyen was his restraint when it came to color, prioritizing a nearly monochromatic array of yellow and earthen hues that lend a sort of unity to his paintings. The remarkable Thunderstorm in our collection is one of his grandest and most evocative compositions, in which his characteristically tonal palette mixes with the somber colors that describe the rain clouds and the roiling slate-gray waves. Have a look at the drama of weather that plays out across the canvas. Beams of sunlight pierce through the storm, and a break in the clouds glows against the darkness. But the wind is fierce. Wiry trees don't stand a chance, bending in the same direction as the mast of the sailboat, enduring a thrashing, even as they bathe in streaking light. And Van Goyen isn't done yet. Oh, nope. A bolt of lightning flashes in the clouds. It isn't a shorthand representation or a conveniently simplified form, but rather a bit of abstract painting, marks dashed across the canvas to evoke an effect as it appeared before his own eyes. For painters like Van Goyen, specializing in landscape meant painting the world that they could see for themselves, allowing the land, the water, and even the climate to become their primary subjects. Van Goyen, like many of his contemporaries, painted for an open market rather than producing work on commission. His clientele consisted of individuals from across social strata, all of whom demonstrated a keen interest in possessing images of their homeland. In Van Goyen's Thunderstorm, the landscape and the activities taking place therein, for that matter, were familiar sights for a 17th century viewer. Yet Van Hoyen goes one step further in linking his subject matter to the fledgling nation. Waving prominently from the sailboat is a tricolor flag. This detail might strike us as perfectly natural today, accustomed as we are to seeing flags displayed everywhere from official state buildings to private lawns. But flags are often markers of political affiliation, used to indicate the authority of a governing body, and this was no less the case in Van Hoyen's time. By 1641, when Van Hoyen signed and dated The Thunderstorm, the tricolor flag had appeared for decades in Dutch paintings, particularly in landscapes. This may seem incidental. The practice of flying banners from ships certainly predates these paintings. But the political situation of the Low Countries at the turn of the 17th century put the land itself at stake. In 1568, after a decade of mounting tensions, several northern provinces of the Netherlands initiated a revolt against the Spanish king Philip II, who had inherited dominion over the region from his father, the Habsburg Emperor Charles V. The revolt, led by a nobleman named William of Orange, was motivated by political reforms, trying to preserve the governing structures of the provinces against the monarchy. There was also the imperative of religious tolerance. The Spanish monarchy aggressively pursued Catholic orthodoxy in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, which had gained many supporters in the northern provinces. After initial military confrontations between the rebels and the Spanish troops, the 7 northern provinces united to form the Dutch Republic. The tricolor flag had already come into use in the early moments of the Dutch Revolt. With William of Orange at the helm, the 3 colors of the House of Orange, blue, white, and orange, were flown during an early Seminole battle, and the flag with horizontal stripes in those same colors appeared on the masts of ships fighting against the Spanish in the late 1570s. So by the early 17th century, we see a red stripe that had replaced the orange band at the top of the flag, possibly inspired by the red flag of the representative assembly of the provinces. The ice skating scenes painted by Hendrik Averkamp, who was about 10 years older than Van Hoyen, are among the earliest landscapes to include the tricolor flag. This declaration of solidarity with the causes championed by the revolt is a remarkable political statement tucked into scenes that seem to depict charming, idyllic existence. The fact of the matter was that Van Hoyen and his contemporaries lived in a nation at war, which makes the deployment of the Dutch flag more than a mere colorful detail. The flag in Van Hoyen's painting issues a visual claim over the land that he depicts, identifying it as not merely picturesque or familiar, but also constitutive of a place that considered itself a sovereign state. Now, there is no flag in Salomon van Ruisdael's view of the Valkhof, but this picture has its own strong connection to the Dutch revolt and to the work of Van Hoyen. Van Hoyen began painting his own river landscapes with the Valkhof as early as 1633, providing the models for Van Ruisdael's versions, including ours, in the much brighter and richer palette that characterized Van Ruisdael's work beginning around this time. Van Hoyen and Van Ruisdael each painted the Valkhof several times, which itself indicates the popularity of the subject. The Valkhof consisted of a set of ruins at the edge of the Republic, in the city of Nijmegen, near the German border. Its more recent history was as a fortress built by Emperor Charlemagne that was almost completely rebuilt by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa sometime in the 12th century. But the site's significance in antiquity was the primary source of its political power. In 1610, the humanist and lawyer Hugo Grotius published a best-selling treatise called On the Antiquity of the Batavian Republic. Printed in Dutch as well as in the customary Latin, the treatise provided justifications for the revolt and for the constitutional government that had already been established, despite the ongoing war with Spain. Grotius revisited the history of the Batavians, an ancient Germanic tribe that had been described by earlier scholars based on the work of the ancient historian Tacitus. According to the various sources, the Batavians, who had inhabited the region that became the Low Countries, were virtuous and courageous lovers of liberty, from whom the modern Dutch people descended. Grotius was the most influential writer in a long line of scholars who claimed the valor and self-governance of the Batavians as the precedent for the Dutch Republic's bid for sovereignty. The struggle against Spain found a particularly potent precursor. In the year 69 AD, when the ancient Romans attempted to conquer the Batavians, they staged a revolt to regain their independence. The story remains so significant in Dutch political consciousness that the famous Rembrandt was commissioned to produce a painting about the Batavian revolt for the Amsterdam Town Hall. The Batavian revolt against their Roman oppressors, the most powerful element of the story in the context of the Dutch war with Spain, had taken place on the land where the Valkhof had later been erected. The site in Nijmegen was thus not simply a beautiful medieval ruin evoking a bygone era. It was, most importantly, hallowed ground that seemed to herald the self-governing destiny of the Batavians' descendants. Van Ruysdael's sweeping view of the Valkhof is inescapably bound up in the political context of the Dutch Republic, all the more so given its date of 1648. January of that year witnessed the signing of the Treaty of Munster, which ended the 80 Years' War, with Spain recognizing the independence of the Dutch Republic. The treaty ushered in a period of relative peace, though it would be short-lived as hostilities with England and France erupted in 1672. But the Republic had enjoyed an unprecedented degree of prosperity even before its sovereignty was formalized. Throughout the 17th century, Dutch painters created images both of industriousness and leisure that constituted contemporary life for people across social strata. Consider this charismatic ice skating scene, painted by Van Ruysdael a few years after his view of the Valkhof. This is a picture formerly in the collection of Anne Getty, which is generously on loan to us from Justin Fickelson and Hannah Fastveit, and you can see it upstairs in Gallery 15. Children and adults alike frolic on a frozen canal outside Utrecht. At far right, revelers riding horse-drawn sleighs take a pause at a refreshments tent. The recognizable Plompe-toren, a medieval watchtower abutting the city's walls, augments our sense of witnessing a local, playful gathering on a brisk winter afternoon. Van Ruysdael, who rarely painted winter scenes, offers a vision of social cohesion in the form of a pastime that citizens of the Republic have in common. Pictures that depicted skating on a frozen canal conveyed a sense of collective identity to the Dutch population, who could recognize themselves in these images. A Scene on the Ice by Albert Cuyp portrays another aspect of contemporary life alongside the familiar motif of skaters. We see laborers, specifically the enterprising fishermen who plunge their nets into the ice, their work undeterred by winter. As in Van Ruysdael's ice skating scene, a recognizable skyline anchors the workers to a specific place, this time the city of Dordrecht, where Cuyp was from. The tower on the horizon belongs to the great church overlooking the River Maas. Nearby, a windmill is silhouetted against the pastel pink sky. This was already a fixture in paintings during the 17th century because it was actually a common sight in the Dutch landscape. Windmills played a fundamental role not only in various industries, but also in the management and drainage of water. In these low-lying regions, windmills made it possible to reclaim land from water. What strikes us today as a quaint image was, in fact, an essential technology for the Dutch. We know that in fairer weather, Cuyp made sketches of his hometown from this perspective, possibly even from a boat or from the opposite bank of the river. This beautiful drawing in the Lehman collection at the Met includes a detailed rendering of the church as well as the nearby windmill. Incidentally, Cuyp also made paintings of the Valkhof from different vantage points than Van Goyen's and Van Ruysdael's, and here bathed in a golden light meant to emulate Italian landscapes of the period. In contrast to the views of rural landmarks and rivers that we've seen so far, the second half of the 17th century saw the rise of the cityscape. One of the most prolific practitioners of this genre of topographically accurate urban vistas was Gerrit Burgheide. The Haarlem-born painter came of age after the end of the 80 Years' War, as Dutch cities continued to expand in response to the enormous success of mercantile trade. Amsterdam, in particular, grew prodigiously, as the port city became the busiest commercial center in Europe. What had begun as a medieval town became, in the 17th century, a bustling city with some 200,000 inhabitants by 1700. The swampland around the port was drained and developed through the construction of a network of canals, the largest of which encircled the historic center. That canal ring, which today is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, became prime real estate for Amsterdam's wealthiest citizens, who built lavish houses facing the canals. Our painting by Burgheide shows the Singel, the oldest and innermost canal, which had initially served as a moat around the city. The doors of the sluis, a gate used to control the flow of water, literally unlocks for us, offering us an unobstructed view of a pleasure boat rowing down the canal. This angle also affords us a glimpse of the Munttoren, the tower with a clockwork and spire at the end of the Singel, where the canal meets the Amstel River. The most prominent structure is the Ronde Lutherse Kerk, or Round Lutheran Church. Completed in 1671, the church was one of the recent additions to the Singel. Construction was constantly changing the face of the city, providing painters like Burgheide with new architecture to portray. The expansion of formerly small towns into big cities over the course of the 17th century was a key feature of the new nation, the canals emblematic of Dutch ingenuity in the face of population explosion. And I have to say, I love that you can still enjoy this view of the Singel today, though you can't so easily capture it in a single photograph. And this is part of what makes Burgheide's composition really special. So what were the sources of Dutch prosperity and triumph on the world stage? In the midst of war with Spain, the founding of the Dutch East India Company in 1602 set the Republic on a vertiginous course towards a novel kind of economic windfall. The company, known as the VOC, was one of the earliest joint stock companies, the first ever to issue tradable shares on a formal stock exchange in Amsterdam. The VOC accumulated a massive amount of capital that allowed it to consistently fund long-distance voyages, making the Dutch Republic dominant in global trade. As its spread reached South Africa, South Asia, East Asia, and the East Indies, the company became the first multinational corporation with the power to maintain its own armies and navies, build semi-autonomous trading posts far from home, mint its own coins, and establish colonies. The Dutch West India Company followed in 1621, allowing the Dutch to compete with Spain and Portugal with colonies in the West Indies, Brazil, and North America. The combined result was a business enterprise with a truly global reach that brought an influx of goods, including the most expensive luxuries, at an unprecedented volume. The commodities that flowed into Amsterdam and other port cities enriched the Republic, most especially the merchant families, the bankers, and the politicians with significant stake in the companies. But the abundance of riches also reached citizens in the middle strata of society, some of whom made their own modest investments. The domestic economy flourished, and the success of the trading companies stimulated industries at home. And traces of the Republic's global exploits filtered into even the most seemingly quotidian contexts. This quietly magnificent still life by Peter Klaas is a case in point. We have before us a simple but solid meal. Breakfast, if you can believe it. A pickled herring on a pewter plate has already been partially enjoyed. It's paired with a couple pieces of bread, a bit of vinegar, and a drink to wash it down with. A beer, of course. Beer was reliably more sanitary than water, so there you have it. The beer glass has a bumpy surface, which is a convenient way to aid the grip of a greasy hand. And paired with this breakfast arrangement, resting against a bundle of matches, we see a long earthenware pipe. Its glowing bowl indicates that it's been lit. Look closely, and you'll see how Claes handles the paint. That barely visible wisp of smoke curling up out of the pipe's bowl is achieved by taking the back of the paintbrush and carving into the paint to create a delicate groove. And don't forget about the brazier, where Claes's brushwork is almost impressionistic, with touches of paint freely dotting the surface to describe the burning coals. I think he's an amazingly assured painter here. Beside the brazier of coals sits an open tin that contains the tobacco. The Dutch West India Company was responsible for the steady flow of tobacco transported to the Republic from the Americas. By 1647, when Claes signed and dated this painting, Amsterdam had become the largest market for tobacco from Spanish, Portuguese, and British colonies in the Americas, especially from plantations in Virginia. The placid experience of this breakfast and our own experience of looking at it is far removed from the brutal realities of the cultivation of tobacco. Enslaved people trafficked across the Atlantic from the west coast of Africa toiled against their will on plantations across the Americas to produce the crop that lined the pockets of European merchants. Both enslaved people and indentured workers were involved in procuring many of the commodity goods sold for profit in Europe, but the conditions of their forced labor were virtually invisible to consumers. Even when Dutch painters treated the subject of laborers in the colonies, the image they put forth was a fiction of an industrious existence. I'm showing you here a landscape by Frans Post, a Dutch artist who actually spent 7 years in the West India Company colony in Brazil. Post saw firsthand the inhumane conditions that enslaved and indigenous people were subject to under Dutch colonial rule, but his depiction of a sugar mill reveals nothing of the notoriously demanding and dangerous work required to process sugar. The citizens of the Dutch Republic understood their nation to be the recipient of great prosperity, and the extraordinary confluence of wealth and artistic achievement eventually led to the identification of this period as the quote-unquote golden age of Dutch history. But the fuller story that takes into consideration the consequences of the Dutch commercial and colonial empire reveals an era of good fortune for some and unbelievable loss and destruction for others. The reality is that Dutch paintings from the 17th century make available to us a tantalizing array of imported goods divorced from the circumstances of their procurement. This is in many ways not so different from the way we live today, never fully knowing where our coveted commodities come from or at what ethical cost. The Dutch Republic was truly connected to nearly every corner of the world, and even paintings that seem to have little to do with global trade can reflect its impact. Jan Steen's The Marriage of Tobias and Sarah is populated with imported goods that reflect just how much Dutch mercantile success affected daily life in the Republic. The main subject of the painting is an Old Testament story. So Tobias, the son of the pious Jewish man Tobit, sets off on a journey to retrieve money from a relative named Sarah. God sends the archangel Raphael, disguised as a mortal man, to accompany Tobias on his long journey to meet Sarah. Then it turns out that poor Sarah has been unable to get married because, alas, a demon has been killing her suitors on their wedding night. Helpfully, Raphael expels the demon, allowing Tobias and Sarah to be married. Steen sets the scene of their marriage in a fancy Dutch country house, kind of mixed with an Italian villa with a distant mountainous vista. Beneath a wreath of sunflowers, which were imported to Europe from the Americas, Tobias gazes heavenward, as if to thank God for his blessing. He reaches out to his bride, Sarah, who is dressed in satin, very much in the latest fashion for a wealthy Dutch woman. Behind her, Steen offers us a hint that the party is about to begin. jolly-looking fellow looks ready to stick a tap into the barrel to pour some wine into the waiting jug. Nearby, a sweet spaniel gazes balefully out at us, assuring us, as a tried and true symbol of fidelity, that the marital union is secure. Now, this allusion to the bonds of marriage is not enough for Steyn. He adds a bit of flair to the scene. Here we see the bride's parents reviewing the marriage contract. Mom, naturally, has her glasses on and is following the text closely with an index finger while Dad looks on over her shoulder. The man across the table from them is the notary who drafted the contract, a figure plucked right out of contemporary Dutch society. Notaries were responsible for recording key events and interactions, from baptisms to deaths to business negotiations. It is, in fact, thanks to these bureaucrats that we still have archival insights into Dutch life in the 17th century. Steyn loved incorporating his own likeness into his paintings, and he's done it here again. The notary is actually a self-portrait. These cheeky intrusions of everyday life go hand in hand with the selection of imported goods that Steyn includes throughout the painting. You've seen the sunflowers above the figures of Tobias and Sarah. In this detail, we've got the carpet from Central Asia, a sumptuous textile that appears commonly in Dutch still lifes from this period, usually shown on a table, although they were actually hung on walls in their places of origin. At far right here, we have a blue and white porcelain bowl that contains a couple of oranges, which were imported from the Mediterranean. Porcelain had been imported from China since the late 16th century, but the volume that entered Europe on Portuguese and Dutch ships increased dramatically in the 17th century. The process of actually fabricating porcelain remained a complete mystery to Europeans until the 18th century. So porcelain vessels, especially of the blue and white variety, were coveted possessions. They soon inspired homegrown imitations that enjoyed their own popularity. Several ceramics factories in Delft, where Johannes Vermeer was from, developed glazes that mimicked the blue and white patterns of genuine Chinese porcelain, capitalizing on the market for variations at a lower price point. And I'm showing you here an example that you can see upstairs in Gallery 15. The textile tucked beneath the porcelain dish also represents an item imported by the Dutch East India Company, chintz cloth from India. The Dutch were prolific cloth merchants, domestically and internationally. In the later 17th century, Dutch merchants created a demand for chintz, a cotton textile whose patterns could be either printed using wood blocks or hand-painted by Indian artisans in the case of the most expensive examples. And you can see here in the center a fragment of authentic chintz. These patterns, too, were imitated by European manufacturers, as in the woodblock printed example at right. The chintz in Steyn's painting appears in at least 6 pictures by the artist, which suggests that he either owned this textile himself or he had access to it in the collection of an acquaintance. There's no narrative reason for the chintz to appear in the depiction of this biblical story, but like the other imported goods, the fabric reflects the availability in the Dutch Republic of marvels from every corner of the world. The trade in foreign commodities even included the transportation of flora and fauna for study and enjoyment alike. This exquisite painting by Melchior de Hondecoeter is a hunting still life, presenting a rich arrangement of dead animals and a basket of fruit. A curious spaniel pops up from beneath a velvet table covering to sniff inquisitively at the game. This selection of animals provides the painter with ample opportunity to show off his ability with the brush, meticulously distinguishing the bristles of rabbit hair from the bird's feather and the spaniel's shaggy fur. Each texture is palpable and astonishingly convincing. Hondecoeter established a reputation as a bird painter, celebrated for his delightful portraits of birds of many different species, from ducks commonly found in Europe to fowl known only as a result of contact with far-flung continents. I'm showing you here a phenomenal painting in the Rijksmuseum featuring a dignified white pelican mingling with a cassowary, which was native to the tropical forests of New Guinea. We've got an American or Caribbean flamingo and an East African crowned crane. This is a typical composition for Hondekoeter. His gift for naturalistic depictions of birds also turned out to be a strategic advantage. He became the eminent painter in a niche market in Amsterdam, specializing in a genre that few other artists tackled. Paintings such as this one were perfectly suited for the canal houses owned by high-status individuals who could boast their taste for exotic animals. These creatures were available at significant cost to the wealthiest members of Dutch society, who sought to emulate aristocrats by building aviaries and menageries. Those who couldn't afford such an extravagance could nevertheless adorn their homes with images of colorful, rare birds cavorting in country estates. Hondekoeter probably based his incredibly lifelike paintings on sketches that he made from direct observation while visiting some of these menageries, though he also must have worked from dead birds, enlivened through the magic of his paintbrush. His still lifes of dead game are no less luxurious, as they allude to the hunt, a pastime reserved for elites. Here, too, exotic birds play a starring role. In the case of our painting, the blue peacock, native to India and Sri Lanka. This regal species had been imported to Europe prior to the 17th century, but continued to be an indication of wealth and status. Hondekoeter's treatment of the peacock's shimmering breast feathers is unparalleled. Highlights in its wings range from touches of white paint to long, luscious strokes that seem freshly laid down. The peacock's head, profiled against the darkness, is particularly heartbreaking. Our attention settles on the squinting eye, leaving us with an impression of instantaneous perception, as though we are witnessing the life drain from this magnificent creature. Hondekoeter took cues for some of his choices from Willem van Aalst, among the most important still life painters of his era, who was also active in Amsterdam. The flowers in a silver vase in our collection, which predates the Hondekoeter, is emblematic of Van Aalst's highly refined manner. You can see how Hondekoeter adapts from Van Aalst the use of a colored marble tabletop, setting up a sensual contrast between cold stone and the softer textures of feathers or leaves. He also borrows the velvet cloth and the dark background that focuses our gaze on the still life. Van Aalst's painting, in its own way, is about contemporary trends in the Dutch Republic. The striped tulip near the center was common in flower still lifes, particularly in the wake of the so-called tulip mania of the 1630s. Tulip bulbs had first arrived in Europe from Constantinople in 1562, though they had been cultivated in modern-day Iran since the 10th century. In the 1590s, a French botanist named Carolus Clusius created a botanical garden at the University of Leiden in the Dutch Republic, where he cultivated tulips. Early on in the Clusius garden, batches of tulips infected with a benign virus bloomed in a streak of color. The seeds of these so-called broken tulips soon found themselves at the center of a booming tulip trade. Here are a couple of the variants of the broken tulip that spurred that tulip trade. These were published in the 1614 botanical volume Hortus Floridus, or Flowery Garden, by the engraver Crispijn van de Passe when he was just 25. In the 1630s, the price of tulip bulbs skyrocketed as ordinary people attempted to buy and resell the coveted bulbs at ever higher prices. After the speculative craze peaked in 1637, the market for tulips stabilized, and the flower became a ubiquitous presence in Dutch paintings. Even the Delftware factories, like the Griekse A, got in on the tulip vogue, producing enormous vases with openings for individual cut stems of tulips and other flowers to decorate an elegant home. The tulip remains perhaps the most recognizable product of the Netherlands, and it's the result of a long history of cultivation that began in this period with the flower as this kind of precious rarity. In Van Aalst's still life, the animated bouquet is set in a silver vase whose design is itself a call-out to the luxury market, this time of a very Dutch variety. Around 1610, an Utrecht silversmith named Adam van Vianen and his brother Paulus, a goldsmith, developed a distinctive, abstracted approach to the design of decorative objects that came to be known as the auricular style. The silver vase in the still life reflects that lasting influence of the Van Vianen's innovations, which were admired and propagated throughout Europe. The rounded, fluid forms give the vase the appearance of an object that has only just solidified from a kind of molten substance. The renown of the auricular style makes the choice of this vase for Van Al's bouquet a telling endorsement of his own countrymen's artistry. At the same time, Van Al sets up a contemplation of the fine line between luxury and vanity. The painting directly conjures the tradition established in the early 17th century of still life as a meditation on the brevity of life. The alluring beauty of the flowers mixes with the onset of their decay. Though some buds have yet to bloom, the tulip is on the verge of dropping its petals. In case you missed this message about mortality, the open pocket watch invokes the minutes ticking away towards inevitable death. As much as Dutch society enjoyed an unprecedented influx of wealth in this period, providing even people of modest means with a measure of disposable income, conspicuous consumption was a moral issue for this profoundly religious population. The Dutch Republic was among the most pluralistic societies in early modern Europe, providing a significant degree of protection to religious minorities. Unlike in other parts of the continent, Catholics like the Haarlem painter Pieter de Grebber constituted one such minority. The Republic's constitution, signed in 1579, had declared freedom of religion in the 7 provinces. However, the Protestant Reformation had been enormously impactful in the northern provinces, and the Republic's adversary in its bid for sovereignty was the staunchly Catholic Empire of Spain. The Dutch governing elite initially established the Calvinist Church as the institution of public religious life, eventually extending the right to hold religious services to other Protestant denominations. Catholics, however, were subject to harsher strictures, forced to practice Mass only in private. The impact of this religious context on the artistic landscape was tremendous. Protestant churches were emptied of sacred images in a bid to curb the idolatry that was associated with Catholicism, which made the art market in the Republic far less dependent on patronage from religious authorities. This partly accounts for the swift rise of secular genres like still life and landscape. But Catholic communities still sought out images for devotional practice. This haunting depiction of Jesus Christ speaks to the relatively marginal position of Dutch Catholics in the 17th century. De Grebber likely produced this painting for a clandestine Catholic church, a space of worship literally hidden within a secular building with no external indication of what was inside. And a few clandestine churches actually still exist in the Netherlands. I'm showing you here the very ordinary facade and the fully outfitted Catholic interior of the Church of Our Lord in the Attic in the very center of Amsterdam. De Grebber's treatment of the mostly nude body of Jesus emphasizes his physical suffering during the torture he endured, flogged by Roman soldiers while tied to a column before his crucifixion. At the same time, the subject is rather divorced from the narrative of the Passion, presenting Jesus as a luminous, transcendent figure. It's an icon of Catholic faith, and it likely functioned as a small-scale altarpiece for a congregation living within a tenuously tolerant society. The Dutch Republic was actually also a refuge for non-Catholics across the continent. By the end of the 17th century, Amsterdam had one of the largest Jewish populations in Europe, including Sephardic communities who had escaped persecution in Portugal and Spain. The Portuguese synagogue, one of 2 in the city, was among the world's largest. Emmanuel de Witte, who mostly painted the interiors of Protestant churches, depicted the synagogue shortly after its completion in 1675. Jewish services were allowed to take place because they did not present a competing doctrine to Protestantism the way Catholicism did. But despite this relative tolerance, like Catholics, Jewish citizens were barred from certain activities and professions, including holding public office. There were, alas, limits to the Republic's professed tolerance. Still, Dutch society was, in many ways, ethnically and culturally diverse, and Dutch cities provided havens for ideas considered heretical elsewhere to circulate. Now, even as the struggle for independence was ongoing, the relative freedoms and significant prosperity that Dutch citizens enjoyed created unparalleled possibilities for upward mobility. Individuals who, 50 years prior, could rarely attain a higher social rank found entrepreneurial and civic opportunities to improve their situation. And Rembrandt van Rijn was one of them, though he was still a scrappy upstart when he painted the striking portrait of a man named Joris de Caulery. Rembrandt was born in 1606 in Leiden, not 30 miles outside of Amsterdam. Beginning in his teenage years, Rembrandt demonstrated significant talent and ambition, training and working mostly in his hometown until around 1631, when he tried his luck in the big city, Amsterdam. Now, portraits were in high demand in Dutch urban centers. This form of self-presentation affirmed and promoted the sitter's social status. Previously, portraits were mostly a privilege indulged at the highest echelons of society by kings, popes, noblemen, and so forth, though artists sometimes did permit themselves a bid for memorialization in the form of self-portraits. Within the first 2 decades of the 17th century, portraiture had taken off in the Dutch Republic as a much sought-after way to assert social status. I'm showing you here 2 wonderful examples of Dutch portraiture in our collection. For each of us in the age of the smartphone, the idea of having images of ourselves is anything but novel. After all, many of us carry in our pockets very sophisticated cameras with a feature literally called portrait mode. So we really must use our imaginations to put ourselves in the shoes of self-assured individuals, such as the sitters in these pictures. In both cases, we are face-to-face with men whose identities are unknown to us today, but the success of each portrait lies in the ways that we can feel acquainted with them even without knowing who they are. The choice of painter, too, is paramount. These gentlemen hired Johannes Verspronck and Frans Hals, the most in-demand painters in the city of Haarlem. Each held a different appeal. Verspronck painted in an exacting manner, rendering every detail meticulously, from the lace of the collar to the lines under the eyes. Hals distinguished himself with a much more varied handling of the brush. The face of the gentleman in white is more highly finished, with brushstrokes blended together into a smooth surface. But the garment consists of freer touches of paint, the brushstrokes energetic and readily visible. Both sitters chose to be portrayed in fine costumes that speak to their wealth and taste. Verspronck's sitter characteristically shows off in black, the color of the most expensive garments, because deep black dyes were achieved through very challenging multi-step processes. The man in the Hals portrait instead wears a white, robustly decorated doublet made of costly silk, adorned with metallic mesh ribbons and with stylish slashed sleeves. Each outfit is flashy in its own way. To boot, both men strike an animated pose that contrasts with the very sober lines of their mouths below their jaunty mustaches. The arm against the hip, with the elbow jutting out, was a conventional stance, understood to convey confidence. Amsterdam witnessed a particularly high demand for portraits as the commercial center of the Republic, where some of the most prominent members of Dutch society lived. Painters who specialize in portraiture could find steady patronage from individuals and families gaining in wealth and status. On the left, we have a portrait of another unidentified and dashing young man by Bartholomeus van der Helst, who was especially favored by Amsterdam elites at the same time that Rembrandt was working there. And I'd like to point out that this trend wasn't all about the men. We have here on the right a lovely portrait of a young woman. It's an early addition to the collection of the Legion of Honor, given in 1927 by the great connoisseur Archer M. Huntington, which we've recently put on view upstairs in Gallery 15. Though the identity of both the painter and the sitter remain a mystery, the young woman's place in Dutch society is not in doubt. Her splendid outfit reflects the latest fashions in Amsterdam in the 1650s, complete with a brooch of cut diamonds and pearls imported from Asia by the VOC. So, when Rembrandt arrived in Amsterdam around 1631, painting portraits presented an ideal means of promoting his own abilities and attaining serious financial success in the process. On a few occasions, however, he received commissions from patrons elsewhere, and Joris de Caulery was among them. He is actually only one of 4 citizens of The Hague painted by Rembrandt. In 1632, Rembrandt traveled to The Hague, which is today about an hour's train ride away from Amsterdam, to go to the court of the stadtholder, or the head of state, who had commissioned from Rembrandt a series about the Passion of Christ. In The Hague, Rembrandt somehow became acquainted with Joris, who was an innkeeper, and he painted his portrait. Joris had Rembrandt portray him wearing the metal gorget, the bandolier, and the yellow tunic of an officer in one of the volunteer militias tasked with protecting and defending the city from intruders. It was a point of pride for men in urban centers to serve in these civic guards. Group portraits of officers had been commissioned since the late 16th century. Joris served in the civic guard of arquebusiers, or armed infantrymen, in The Hague. And this is most clearly communicated through the musket in his hand, which actually proved to be a key hint for modern art historians to identify Joris as the sitter. This notarial record from 1654, an accounting of Joris's possessions, mentions a portrait to be inherited by Joris's daughter Josina, done by Rembrandt, showing Joris with a roer, or a musket, in his hand. His will from 1661 lists the portrait again, along with a portrait of his son, also by Rembrandt. It turns out that this portrait is the only one painted by Rembrandt that fits that description. Joris would eventually become a distinguished naval captain, but the musket that ties him to the city militia turned out to be the crucial means to return his name to his likeness. Joris exudes confidence and conviction, equipped with musket and sword, and striking the telltale pose with the elbow akimbo. Rembrandt's sharp eye is revealed in the turn of that elbow. Joris's face is so captivating that it almost takes a moment to realize how empty the background is. Without any objects or architecture to aid him, Rembrandt pulls off a feat of illusionism, creating a sense of space behind and around Joris merely through the manipulation of light and color. Rembrandt also lavishes attention on Joris's individualized features. I particularly love the sprightly shape of his groomed mustache, in contrast with his rather informal, poofy hair. Meanwhile, his eyes gleam with a psychological depth that makes Rembrandt's portrait so compelling. Rembrandt confers an aliveness to him. So when he gazes back at us, we sense uncannily the presence of a real person. Moreover, I find it deeply moving that to realize that we get to relive an encounter between the two men in a very particular moment in time, when Joris, the innkeeper, proudly served his city, and when the 26-year-old Rembrandt was starting to make a name for himself. Here, still using for his signature the monogram RHL, R for Rembrandt, H for Harmen's Zoon, or son of Harmen, and L for Leiden, his beloved hometown. And in fact, the old studio in Leiden, which Rembrandt kept while he was starting out in Amsterdam, was also probably the place where he completed Joris's portrait. I'd like to close today with one of my favorite paintings in the collection, which reflects the cosmopolitanism of the Dutch Republic and invites us to consider anew what it meant to belong in this new nation. The Crowning of Mirtillo by Ferdinand Bol, who was one of Rembrandt's most successful students, takes its subject from a famous episode in an Italian play. Il Pastor Fido, the Faithful Shepherd, was first published in Venice in 1590. It was translated into Dutch multiple times between 1638 and 1650, coinciding with the opening of Amsterdam's first city theater in 1637. There existed already in the Republic the tradition of traveling theater troupes who put on plays originating in other parts of Europe for a Dutch-speaking public. Foreign plays were immensely popular, even Spanish plays, despite originating in enemy territory. Il Pastor Fido tells a tragic-comic tale of star-crossed lovers. The nymph Amaryllis and the shepherd Mirtillo have fallen in love, but fatefully must remain apart because Amaryllis is betrothed to someone else. Bol chose to depict the climax of a very memorable scene in the play, favored by painters at the time. Amaryllis decides to host a kissing contest among her maidens to determine which of her girlfriends is the best kisser. In a bid to participate, Mirtillo disguises himself as a woman. When the lovers share a passionate kiss, Amaryllis crowns Mirtillo the winner. The triumphant moment proves delightful for the viewer. We are in on Mirtillo's ruse, while the characters within the painting remain oblivious. Bol accordingly makes the picture itself visually dazzling, deploying a brilliant color palette and carefully focusing on the sheen of satin dresses and the sparkling diamonds and pearls worn by the women. Such finery was not unfamiliar to Bol. He was born into a rich family and lived in a canal house in one of the poshest neighborhoods in Amsterdam. What is perhaps more surprising is Bol's decision to include a figure quite unlike the others. In the background, peering over Amaryllis' shoulder, is a woman with darker skin. Her features are specific, too, closer to what we might expect from a portrait likeness, in contrast to the rather generic faces of the other women. Could she be based on a real individual? We know that Rembrandt, Bol's teacher, lived in a neighborhood that was home to a small community of people of African descent. Though Dutch merchants were actively involved in the transatlantic slave trade, slavery itself was illegal within the Dutch Republic. Bol could cross paths with free black neighbors living and working in the city. There were also people of mixed race in the city, including many with ties to the Jewish communities of immigrants from the Iberian Peninsula. The woman in The Crowning of Mirtillo may very well represent one of these individuals, perhaps someone making her living modeling for artists like Bol. Her appearance in this painting offers a glimpse of a society that was actually less homogeneous than we may perhaps imagine. To this day, certain subjects and motifs remain coded as quintessentially Dutch, in many cases prolonging an association with origins in 17th century painting. The Dutchness of certain things, windmills, tulips, blue and white ceramics, seems natural today, but the initial formation of that Dutch identity was a complex process unfolding against a background of intense social and economic change. From time to time, when we take a closer look, we find in 17th century paintings opportunities to think again about what it meant to be Dutch in an age of precarious freedom, to consider how the legacies of the 17th century continue to influence our sense of what Dutchness means today. Thank you. Thank you. So we may have time for a question or two. We may have microphones.
Please raise your
perhaps not.
Please raise your hand, and we'll bring a mic to you.
Let's see. I think one here. Oh.
Exterior dimmels of the glass
Yeah, that's such a it's a great question about the breakfast still life with the herring and the beer glass with the bumpy surface. Yeah, and whether cutlery was used. I think cutlery was more a luxury than we may imagine today. You do see knives fairly frequently in still life paintings, but I think people were eating in large part, especially people in the kind of middle strata of society, were eating with their hands. Yeah. Other questions? Oh, over here, yes.
Hello. I might have been erroneously telling people for years that in the Jan Steen painting, I always thought that the guy kegging the beer was a self-portrait and not the notary. Has there ever been a discussion of that?
So indeed, the notary is the self-portrait. I recommend looking up Jan Steen's self-portrait in the Rijksmuseum's collection, where you can really see the resemblance to the notary. But I think your sense of that guy ready to tap that barrel, he looks like he could be a self-portrait because Steen clearly had so much fun painting his very jolly face. Yeah. Yeah. And I will say, in other Steen paintings, Steen actually was more often kind of specialized in painting scenes of very slovenly domestic life, to the point where today in the Netherlands, if you have a messy house, people still say you have a Jan Steen household. So in some of those scenes, he is actually sometimes like the drunkest person in the composition, the self-portrait. Yeah, yeah. Any other questions? Oh, one more here. Yeah. Here, want to grab them? Here's the microphone here. There you go.
Can you?
Yes.
Back to the same painting you just talked about. I was struck by the woman reviewing the contract.
Yes,
And
right.
so what's the position of?
It's this really kind of delicately observed interaction between the notary and the parents of the bride. And I mean, it's so delicately painted. You really have to see it in person to notice. She's got a kind of pince-nez eyeglasses on her nose, and you can see she's holding her index finger to the text of the contract, making sure everything is good to go. So it's an amazing kind of capturing of an interaction in contemporary life. Yeah. Okay, I think we're ready to go, but I will invite you all to join me in the porcelain gallery. If you go down the hall on the same floor to the other end of the building, we're going to have a little gathering there and some special treats to be distributed. So please join me there, and thank you so much for coming today.